Hi, I'm Jack, and I'm joined here with Piper,
Hi, I'm Piper.
and we're here to talk to you about the Great Chicago Fire and the Peshtigo Fire. So, just to start off with some information is about the Peshtigo Fire and the Chicago Fire is that they both happened on October 8th in 1871. And I'm going to be talking about the Peshtigo Fire today, and Piper's going to be talking about the Chicago Fire.
So the Chicago fire did start on October 8th on Sunday night around 9 o'clock. People say that Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocked over an oil lamp in her barn and that's what started the fire, but the fire department was unable to determine what caused the fire, so people testified, 50 people. People sent in 11,100 handwritten notes in 9 days, and the fire department came to the conclusion that it wasn't enough information to determine what started the fire.
But people thought it was a lantern that was in a barn.
Yeah, she was milking her cow and the cow kicked, and they thought the lantern caught the hay on fire in the barn.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, so the Chicago or the Peshtigo fire started a little differently than a cow knocking over a lantern. So this fire started by just like forest fire, like it was a big forest fire, and it was happening in a Peshtigo, which was a town that was a big logging town, and it was primarily made out of wood. Like all the houses and churches and bridges were made out of wood. And during that time, there was also a huge drought between July and September of that year. There was only 2 inches of rain, and this made everything extremely dry, and it just led to a really big disaster. And it has the Peshtigo fire named as the most devastating forest fire in American history. So a common practice in Peshtigo was to burn small fires that were supposed to be controlled, so they could clear land for farming and railroads. And on this year, since it was so dry, the fire, it got out of hand, and the fire department wasn't able to like put the fire out and control it. And it's crazy because the fire department only had one horse and drawn carriage that was used as their like fire truck, and it was a steam pump that was pumping out water from any water source that was nearby. So it was like it was more like of a natural like disaster versus like an animal like knocking over a lantern.
Yeah. Chicago experienced a drought that year from July to October. They only received 1/4 of their normal amount of rain, and the buildings were built with single layer fireproof material on the outside, but all their buildings were built with wood structure under the fireproof material. So the city was mainly built in wood, and the weather was hot and dry, so all the wood in the buildings were dried out, so that's why the fire spread so fast. And because there was a strong southwest wind, the fire was able to spread quicker, and the flames reached almost 100 feet tall.
100 feet?
Yeah, and the wind was 30 miles per hour.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, like, it makes sense, like, everything was, like, it was 1871, so, like, everything was built, like, of wood, but it would just, like, kind of set up for, like, these 2 fires to happen, like, in a disaster, plus the drought and everything being made of wood. They just created, like, a perfect situation, it seems like, for these 2 fires to happen.
To spread really fast.
So, more about the Peshtigo fire is that the fire was incredible. It grew incredibly because everything was made of wood in Peshtigo, and the fire reached around 2,000 degrees. And there are a lot of people describe the fire to be like a fire tornado, and everything in its path was just like taken and thrown everywhere, and it was just a giant fire tornado that was like, I've never even heard of a fire tornado before, and people experienced it in 1871, which I thought was pretty crazy.
In the Great Chicago Fire, they said there were fire devils spinning in the sky, which was like a connection of spirals of fire, basically.
An account from Mary Keith, who was someone who told her story to the Peshtigo Times newspaper. Quote from her was, "It had been a very dry season. For about 2 weeks, the sun was hidden by smoke. The clothes on the line looked so gray. A feeling that something was going to happen hung over the city. The fire came so suddenly, it was like heavens opened and it rained fire." So we can see here that Mary Keith had a little different experience. she said that it was raining fire versus what other people said it was a fire tornado. But either or, like, both a fire tornado and fire rain is a terrible thing to happen. And it's kind of weird that, I don't know if it's because it happened, the fire actually happened, but she said that something weird was gonna, she felt like something weird was gonna happen. So I wonder if, like, they thought that a fire was even, like, a possibility that could, like, ruin their town and everything, or if, like, what she was thinking that something bad could happen would be, like, famine or something. I don't know.
On October 7th, on the Saturday, there was a fire actually on that day that burned 4 square blocks on Canal Street, which also burned during the Great Chicago Fire the next day. And then during the Great Chicago Fire, the fire department was actually understaffed, and while they were understaffed, their waterworks were destroyed on Pine Street, and that was their main water source, so they were out of water and they couldn't basically control it because they were out of resources.
Do you think they would have been able to control it if, like, they had the correct, like, staff and, like, water? Because, like, I mean, if the fire department was, like, used to it, maybe they could have, like, controlled it before it, like, spread all over the place.
I mean, maybe, but because of, like, what was happening with, like, the wind moving it so fast and, like, the dry wood, I don't really think they would have, I mean, they would have maybe controlled it a little better, but probably not have, like, put it out.
Yeah.
Like, the damage still would have been there, basically.
Yeah, there was so much damage for the Peshtigo fire. So Peshtigo is in North Wisconsin, and it's actually 250 miles north from Chicago and where the Great Chicago Fire happened on the same day, which is, I think that's a crazy coincidence because literally like 250 miles the same day, 2 giant fires in like American history like happened.
Yeah, that's crazy.
On the same
And
day.
they were close to each other.
Yeah, only 250 miles, which is like nothing. But yeah, so in Peshtigo, there was like it was a small like area, and around it there were 16 communities and neighboring towns that were affected by the fire because it grew so much and took over everything in its path. And so what separated Peshtigo from some of the other towns was one of the rivers, and it was the Green Bay, and since it was a logging town, there was pine trees that they would put across the bay, and that would be like their wood bridge. So when it came time, the fire just spread all across the Green Bay and affected 16 communities and neighboring towns like around the area, which is like crazy because it just grew at an insane level. I think one person said that Peshtigo burned to the ground in 1 hour, so it just had crazy power.
Yeah, the Chicago River runs right through Chicago, and it said that the fire jumped the Chicago River not once but twice, and when it jumped it impacted residence buildings. It burned down churches, post offices, the custom house, the Chamber of Commerce, banks, newspaper offices, some railroad cars that were on the railroad, the waterworks. It blew up the gas works. It burned down private homes, businesses, hotels, and actually like the telegraph office that they were sending telegrams to other people. They actually sent telegrams to St. Louis, Milwaukee, and I think that was it. But it also burned down breweries. Some of like specific buildings it burned down was the New Jerusalem Church, a Catholic church. And then some of the newspapers that were burnt down were the Tribune, the Times, the Republican, the Post, the Mail, the Union, and other publications. It actually burnt down Crosby's Opera House, McVicker's Theater, Hooley's Opera House, Dearborn Theater, and a Woods Museum. And then one of the banks that were affected were the Illinois National Banks. And then the railroads that were destroyed were Pacific, Rock Island, Lakeshore, Michigan, Southern Railroads, and Van Buren Street. Other buildings that were destroyed were hotels, private residences that were 2 stories built of wood, and breweries actually. And one of the things noted in many of the newspapers read were elevators were really valuable, and it said that a lot of buildings with elevators were destroyed, which was kind of a big financial loss for them. But
so it seems like they lost so many like big entities and like big like businesses and buildings like that play a role in a town. So like, what kind of effect did it have like on the town afterwards?
They actually recovered quite quickly because 20 years later they hosted the 1893 World Fair. They had a population of 300,000 people at the time, and 100,000 people were homeless. That was about 1/3 of their population. And the Great Rebuild, they called it. They opened a new urban center. They restarted the big businesses, and they had new architecture. And basically that turned into the modern Chicago because they built up and not out. So a lot of their big, like, tall city buildings that they have now were inspired then. And they enacted new fire laws that put expensive materials, and basically the materials were brick, stone, marble, and limestone. And the expensive materials pushed many people out of Chicago because their insurance didn't pay out because the local insurance companies couldn't pay everyone. So they had to move into the suburbs, which expanded the suburbs. And then the materials that were left, a lot of lumber yards and mills were left, so the agricultural trade was okay and people were still employed. Most railroad tracks were okay because they were made out of yellow. They were made out of metal, and so they just had to get new railroad cars. And then a lot of states and countries donated aid to Chicago to help them rebuild. A lot of people donated food and materials so they could start rebuilding, and starvation was present. They said about 6,000 gallons of soup at a soup kitchen was used a day.
Yeah, so I mean, like, that's like a lot of like damage that was done and a lot of rebuilding they had to do, but kind of seems like it was like for the better, and like it really like kind of made them grow. I mean, even though the fire like wasn't a good thing, it kind of sounds like it expanded Chicago and made it like the place it is today a little bit.
Yeah, the fire laws definitely changed. It probably helped prevent more fires. I mean, that could have been a lot worse. It could have built down the entire city. The only parts of the city that, well, basically 3/4 of the city were infected because the north part of the city burnt down, the south part of the city burnt down, and then part of the west part of the city. And like in the southern part of the city was where most of the wealth was. So a lot of wealthy people lost their homes, and then in the northwest side, that's where all their businesses were. So a lot of their businesses were destroyed, so they had to rebuild them. But it allowed people to restart with like a clean slate to try their business again.
That's good. And yeah, just like seemed like with the new like fire laws too, it probably definitely helped in the future because you got to learn from your mistakes. So this kind of was a teaching moment for Chicago, it seemed like.
Yeah, many people. And then the O'Leary's house, so Patrick and Catherine O'Leary were like accused of basically starting the fire, but they were proven like they didn't have guilt for it, they couldn't prove it. And in 1956, the Chicago Fire Academy built their academy on the O'Leary's old barn, which was kind of interesting. And the only building that didn't burn completely down in the Great Chicago Fire was actually the O'Leary's barn. So the fire started in the barn, but it was left standing after.
That's crazy. Like,
which is really weird. So people thought it was like Jake's almost. And the fire started around like 9 o'clock, 9:30. And Mrs. O'Leary actually said she went to bed at 8:30, but no one could actually prove that because it was just her and Patrick in the house, and Patrick obviously wasn't going to tell like the real truth because they didn't want to be charged with it.
Yeah.
With starting it.
Yeah, that's insane though. Like the place where everyone thought it was is the place that's actually standing. So maybe like it kind of frees her of like being accused of it because her place would have burned down if it started there, I feel like.
Yeah, but they said it started behind her barn, but her house was left, which was weird.
I don't know.
But they don't know for sure how it started.
So yeah, even though you had a lot of damage in the Great Chicago Fire, the Peshtigo Fire seemed to be more devastating to me because it was also the deadliest. So besides the death toll, it burned 1.2 million acres of land, which is an insane amount of land that is being burnt. It ranged from houses to farmland to railroads. Like anything that was around that area in 1871, it pretty much took control of and destroyed. So in Peshtigo alone, 800 lives were lost, and like I said, it was burned down to the ground in 1 hour. Around 1,500 people were injured, and 3,000 people were left homeless. And in total, there's around 1,200 people that were confirmed dead. But the crazy thing about this fire was that it killed so many people in such a short amount of time, that they had such a hard time getting an accurate death toll because there weren't enough survivors to get like an actual count.
Oh wow.
In all these towns, so there weren't enough survivors to count how many people, and the fire burnt so hot that it disintegrated like
The dead
almost
bodies.
pretty much like all the dead bodies. And some of like the only ways they could tell from if there was a body there was like from like if there was like metal on the ground from like someone's belt, or like it would just be like bones. And when they were like, or just bones would be like the remains, so like when they were like burying them, so and putting them in like caskets, they would just like put like 5 people in one because it was just like bones. Like there was like, it was so bad.
That's terrible.
And so it just left tons of people dead and have many losses. And it's like a huge tragedy that was like skipped over in American history because people talk about the Great Chicago Fire more than the Peshtigo Fire, but the Peshtigo Fire was more devastating and had more people die. And people, in order to like try to survive, people would jump in the river that was nearby, but the water was so hot from the 2,000-degree fire that they would just burn up.
Oh my god, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's like a hot tub.
Yeah.
But smoke inhalation was like another way people died, or flying objects from the fire hurricane, or people were just burnt just because the fire was so hot that you didn't really have to be that close to it to feel the heat that was coming from it.
Yeah, that's crazy. You mentioned, how long did the Peshtigo fire last?
Well, just in Peshtigo, it burned Peshtigo ground to the floor in 1 hour, but I think it took a little longer for it to reach like all 16 communities and get the total 1,200 person death count, but it grew extremely fast, so I can only imagine it destroyed all that land pretty quickly.
Yeah. I think the Chicago fire might have destroyed more things, but yours was definitely more deadly because of the amount of people it killed.
Yeah, it was more, I feel like mine had more people that were like died or injured, but yours seemed like it had like a bigger like toll on Chicago because it affected all those businesses and
The community, basically, yeah.
And yeah. Go.
Oh, yeah. And so they only accounted for 120 bodies that were found in the fire, and because the fire burned most people, they like averaged the death count out to probably 300 people because a lot of people were unaccounted for and they just couldn't find them. So basically it means like they just burned with all of the buildings. Yeah. So
and that's crazy though, but because 300 people in my estimated death count was 1,200, so it's had like 4 times the amount of people killed, and yet it's like not talked about in history as much as like the Chicago fire. I
think it's because, I mean, Chicago's a big city, so I think the popularity of it more hit. And do you know what the population of Peshtigo was?
I don't, but I think it wasn't a very big town. I think it was around like 1,000 or 1,500 people.
Yeah, because Chicago had a population of 300,000, which is kind of crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, only 300 people died, but it left so many more people homeless. It left 100,000 people homeless, which is kind of insane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mine was only 3,000 people left homeless, so there was a difference in that. Yeah.
These are still big numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fire spanned 4 miles long and almost a mile wide. It destroyed everyone's homes, basically. It was in the... it started in the southwest side, but it spread to the north, south, completely destroyed that, and then a partial side of the west side. So it averaged out to be about 2,000 acres. And they estimate that the damage caused for property damage was about 200 million, and 17,000 to 17,500 buildings were destroyed.
That's insane.
Which is a lot.
So I also wanted to like compare like the Peshtigo fire, because it was a forest fire, to like the California wildfires that are happening today, just to like bring it back to some like current news, and all those like wildfires that were happening in 2018. So that those wildfires actually burned 1.9 million acres of land, which is more than the Peshtigo fire. The Peshtigo fire was 1.2 million acres that were burned. So the California wildfires did control a bigger area and affect more land, but the death toll for the California wildfires were only like around 100 people dead. versus the 1,200 people in the Peshtigo fire. So it's like, even though it's on the news all the time, you see about the California fires and how they're very devastating and affecting so many people's lives. I mean, they definitely are, but the Peshtigo fire killed so many people, and yeah, it's like not talked about at all, which is like one of the major points about this fire.
Do you think that the California wildfires are handled better and the death toll is less because of the new technology? Like, they actually have like good fire trucks, whereas like in 1871 they literally had, like you said, like
horse and carriage.
A horse, yeah,
yeah,
which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, so definitely, yeah, I feel like, and also we probably learned some of that from the Chicago fire, because you said that new fire laws were put into place, and there was probably more staffing because they knew that they couldn't have less people, like they needed to have this many firefighters on at all times. And also I feel like there's more like technology too, like you can use like
The
helicopters
planes.
and stuff to put out
Yeah,
water.
you always see that on the news.
Yeah, and like there's aerial coverage so you can see like where it's burning and all this kind of stuff, and I don't think they had that in 1871, so it's like definitely a big like technology advancement that we have like now versus when these fires were happening.
Yeah, and even now, with like the media coverage, I mean, we don't normally see a lot about the California wildfires, and it's talked about all the time how it's not like made people like aware about it as much as it was. But I mean, I think the Great Chicago Fire definitely took all the media coverage away from Peshtigo, just because it was like a popular like hustle bustle town,
And it happened on the same day.
so it like kind of like overshadowed it. But I mean, Chicago did like telegram to other cities like Milwaukee and like St. Louis for help, and Cleveland, that was the other city. But I mean, I don't know if any of them came, because in Milwaukee, like they already had the Peshtigo fire going on, and that's also in Wisconsin. So
And also you get like it would probably be like the cities would be burnt and towns would be burnt by the time like anyone wouldn't be able to get there to help, because if they were bringing water too, you can't travel with enough water to put out a fire in 1871 very quickly. So
yeah, that's another thing. I mean, their water source was destroyed in Chicago, which probably made it even harder to control, just because like you have no water to put out a fire with 30-mile-per-hour winds, and you're understaffed on a fire department. So basically, like, you can't do anything at all to help.
Yeah, they're pretty much like useless for these giant fires that grow so big.
Yeah. But then after the fire, the city actually provided free transportation by train and railroad for people to get them basically out of the city, so they could go seek shelter at their friend's house or anything, to prevent them from being homeless and starving, basically. And on October 16th, they had already put up 100 temporary houses, and they were starting to build more schoolhouses that burnt down, and they already started building the Court of Chambers. And still on October 16th, the banks resumed, and the money in the banks were actually saved because of the fireproof vaults they had. So they didn't actually lose any like real money in the banks that burnt down, basically.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it also seems like for yours, like the difference between ours two fires is that like you had more relief like afterwards, because the population of Chicago is definitely bigger than Peshtigo. So
The name basically attracted people to want to give money to them.
Yeah, and it seems like you had more survivors too. Like for the Peshtigo fire, pretty much just wiped out the entire like population pretty much. Yeah, so like there wasn't much like relief or things to do afterwards. Like there weren't enough people to like count how many bodies there were. So let alone like need to like set up like shelters and everything. It was just like a smaller town, and it was just different than the Chicago fire.
Yeah, the publicity definitely did not help Peshtigo at all.
Yeah,
they
no.
received no aid from anyone because Chicago was taking all the limelight, basically.
All right, so it was really good hearing about the Chicago fire and like how it was different from the Peshtigo fire. I like really learned a lot from like all the information you were giving me. It was really helpful, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't know about the Peshtigo fire. In all the newspaper articles I read, it was never mentioned because basically the Great Chicago Fire kind of overshadowed it.
Definitely. All right, thanks for coming and listening.
Bye.